So when it comes to language, what I find is that I don't know if language is a big disconnect, at least when it comes to when we're talking about within the organization. What I find is a little bit different in my interactions with these businesses is that sometimes our language and their language is not the same. That I find more of that rather than their language internally not being the same. The disconnect I do see is that each of these functions is very focused on their outcomes.
All right, awesome. I've actually been looking forward to this conversation for a while. We started talking about a couple months ago. You guys are helping us with kind of build a AI maturity model for us, which we've been really excited about. We've started rolling it out. I know there's more work being done in that. So first of all, thanks for helping out. But I'm excited about that tool because that tool is going to be this, it's going to really help kind of bridge the gap of like where a company's at in their own maturity. And it's not going to be a light tool, right? It's going to be it's a pretty robust 10 categories, 300 some odd questions. So I'm pretty excited about releasing that, and you guys are helping build that, which I appreciate.
Well, absolutely, it's a pleasure. It was very good timing for us too, because these were all things that we had started to think about in the last 6 months or so, and we started talking to you, and you had all of this work, years and years of experience boiled down into this one tool. So it was very exciting for us. So we're building it, yes, but to be honest, we're getting a lot more just learning how you've built that tool and how you're transforming the UI and put it into in an easy web interface. But really all that work that you've done over years, it's leapfrogging the work we do with our customers quite a bit. So thank you for that. That's a very exciting project for us.
Jason Hine is the brains behind that. He's going to really use it. In fact, I was just talking to a distributor right before we got on. So they're a 3M distributor, and they were kind of talking about, okay, so we're going to do the training. That's great. How do is there anything kind of personalized we can have to see like what our next steps are? And I presented the maturity assessment, and Jason's going to spend some time with them. So it's going to be a great program. I would love to hear in our conversations, you've actually been someone that knew a lot about the space, and which is always a pleasure to have a conversation with someone that actually knows the space. So I would love to kind of hear about what's been your journey into Codup. How did all this start, and kind of where, when did you start into this process, and how did you get here?
Absolutely. So we started Codup just 13 years. We had our 13th anniversary.
Wow.
1st September. It's a funny story. I started because I wanted to get married. I tell everyone this. I started the business because I wanted to get married. The job I was in, I didn't make enough money, and I couldn't see a path to make enough money fast enough. And so I left that job. I loved the job. It was very exciting, very challenging. It was fun in all the right ways. But so I started, got into business, did one thing for a couple of years. That didn't work out too well, but it primed me for this. And so I started this just after I got married. And it's been an exciting journey. We started off doing very simple HTML brochures 13 years ago, and then we got into WordPress and all that. But we got into B2B about 10 years ago. It was coincidental. We weren't looking for it. We didn't understand what B2B e-commerce was. It just fell into our lap as any project. And then very quickly I realized that it was something different. This wasn't just e-commerce. It was different. I couldn't quite put a name to it, but it wasn't e-commerce. And so I started to research, and I told you that was around the time when I found you online, and you used to run a community called B2X. And that was my first introduction and exposure to B2B e-commerce years and years ago. I think that community of yours, I don't know you were able to get a lot of critical mass to it or something, but you put out a lot of really good material, and I consumed a whole lot of it very fast. And that literally was my first exposure to B2B. And so, just kept on learning because we did that one very large project that turned out to be a very big one. We started to get a whole lot more. And so we've been doing B2B e-commerce for the last 10 years. And, iteratively, we've just, every new project, we learn something new, and we're now at a point where, B2B e-commerce is our core focus. That's the biggest part of our business. And we are now at a point where we've become not just a dev shop. We've successfully done several digital transformation initiatives with our customers, where we can work with them very strategically as a consultant and help them map out the entire journey, not just small chunks of the engagement. So we've gotten quite good at that in the last couple of years, and we'll continue to grow, and we'll continue to support our customers.
It's funny, a couple of things. So the B2X thing was, I've tried to start a community. This is the third time.
Yeah.
I've tried to do this twice. I tried to start the digital branch community when I wrote the book, and then we launched the B2X Academy, and with all that training, and it just wasn't the right timing for it. Like, it just, it didn't have the critical mass behind it. It was good information, and all of that is the baseline for what we've done in the association. But it took Brett really to say, this is how you actually run a community, and this is how you gather people. And so it was really him that built this. And even though a lot of that was the foundation, the information and the training was amazing. It just wasn't the right time, and we've used that now. So that's amazing that you were part of that.
You're the OG of B2B.
I mean, I do consider myself the OG of B2B, mainly by age. I mean, I started writing when I was in 2007 on this stuff, and it's pretty interesting. When it was still called e-business. That's what we call it. I want to actually go back to e-business.
E-business?
I want to move. I want to go retro. I want to call it e-business from now on instead of e-commerce.
I think that might be a good idea, because what I find is whenever I use the word B2B e-commerce, it oftentimes it turns off many C-level executives.
Yeah.
They immediately picture Amazon or Walmart, and they go, "Oh, we don't want to do e-commerce. We're not doing e-commerce."
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a very narrow, focused word that has come to mean a very specific thing, and many of these B2B merchants sort of don't want to be boxed in that way.
No, absolutely. I was talking to Paul DeForno yesterday, and we were having this whole conversation about the things that are most important to customers. And at the end of the day, it's rarely the e-commerce. Like, the transaction part of this is the smallest part that's meaningful to customers. I mean, it's often the most meaningful to the distributor or manufacturer, and the least meaningful to customers. At the end of the day, it's not. I mean, e-commerce really isn't the point of any of this. So I love the idea of e-business. When do you think you'll make as much money as you made when you were employed? Starting an agency isn't quite the most profitable thing that people think.
I learned that. Well, I learned
you
that.
You learned that 10 years in?
Well, no, 5 years in, or maybe 3 years in. So, when you start a business and you don't have any employees, and you're working for yourself, but you're really a freelancer. At that point, you love calling yourself a business, but you're a freelancer, and that's when the money's great. But then, as you start to hire 1 or 2 employees, the reality starts to set in, and you're like, you can either be a freelancer and make great money, or you could build a business and follow all that dream of impact and all that good stuff. But that requires going without money for many years. So for us, it was a good 8 years, 9 years.
That's seriously a lesson for everyone. Yeah. And this is the case. I mean, there's any agency SI owner will say this. you can make great money as a freelancer, but if you're trying to build a business, which is a worthwhile endeavor, right? That's something worth
Absolutely.
doing, is building a business and something that's going to last, and legacy and all of that. But once you start adding employees,
Yep.
you would think profitability would go up, but it often you don't ever make as much money as you did when you were one or two people. For sure. It's kind of a funny thing.
One of my mentors, not one of my mentor, I call her my professional mother, said to me, you start disagreements the moment there's two people in a room.
So
That's
true.
when it starts, and it's very true. So that doesn't mean disagreement is a bad thing. It's just something to navigate. And anyway, I thought that was relevant to note here.
Yeah, no, that's so true. One of the things you and I have talked a lot about is this idea of executive alignment. I think it fits so well into, we're recording this in October, November, December, as a theme for us is going to be this executive alignment, certainly in the conference in November. And executive alignment, I think, is probably, I don't think it's been identified as one of the top issues, right? Really the top three issues right now are executive alignment, customer adoption, which very, very much fits into executive alignment, and then a tactical thing in product content. Like, how do we get product content? Every day I talk to someone, every day when I talk to manufacturing distributors, product content is the most tactical issue that's out there. But this idea of executive alignment, I think you've done a lot of thinking on that. Just talk about, when, what are the ramifications of not having executive alignment today in today's kind of culture of distribution and manufacturing?
Well, there are many ramifications. They would appear all the way from top to bottom. But if I was to try and consolidate them in some way, what happens is you have different leaders, functional leaders, and most times your stakeholders in any B2B digital transformation engagement are going to be IT. There's going to be IT. There's going to be marketing, and depending on how mature that organization is within themselves, there may be a separate product function, and there may be a separate e-commerce function. And then, of course, from where I sit, sales is the ultimate customer of most of the work that we do for B2B e-commerce, for B2B merchants. Most of the work we do tends to serve the sales team internally. Of course, it serves customers, and it serves a whole lot of different people. But from my point of view, sales is the biggest customer. And so you have these 3 or 4 or 5 groups who aren't aligned. They will all have their pain points, and they will all have their strategic objectives. But without executive leadership being aligned, they will continue to pull this initiative in different ways, in different directions. And so that just manifests itself in 100 different ways, where it's hard to put any kind of a roadmap together. It's even hard sometimes to get the right people in the room. Sometimes it takes us for one high-level meeting to take place for something that's very urgent for the business. Sometimes it takes us a month and a half to 2 months just to get all the right people in the room. All of that is time and opportunity lost to be doing whatever they need to be doing in order to grow or create efficiencies. On one point, they all understand that it's urgent, and they all agree it's urgent. But then, for various reasons that are mostly to do with misalignment, they simply can't come into a room. And even when they do come into a room, rarely you'll be able to get a decision fast. And so, that manifests in terms of delayed decisions, misalignment in terms of, conflicting priorities, budgets get destroyed, budgets get wasted. Because they're not working together, you'll have one project here, another project here, and those projects aren't working together. Very often you have projects that each stakeholder has ideated without doing stakeholder management and without the buy-in of the relevant stakeholders, and they will build out the entire project, spend crazy amounts of money to roll that out, only to find out after rolling out that other internal stakeholders don't agree with what that project was supposed to do, or they had a very different idea. And I've seen, it creates politics, it creates delayed timeline, and then all that gets bucketed into this big number of 71%, or some I don't know what that number is, but 71% of digital transformation initiatives fail, right? I don't know, it's some crazy number. I don't know exactly if it's 70%. But then if you have executive leadership that is aligned and that understands the priority of the entire initiative and leads it from the front, and delegates correctly and helps all of the team prioritize correctly, then there's alignment, and then there's alignment at every level and across all the functions of the organization. There's delegation that happens properly. There's accountability that happens properly. Budgets go into the right things at the right times. And then you're still going to do projects. You're still going to spend the money. But then that money is now moving the needle for the organization. Moving the needle, whether that's business outcomes, commercial outcomes, growth, new markets, operational efficiencies, whatever they might be.
How do you deal with when you look at like a CEO, a CFO, VP of sales, VP of supply chain? I mean, these are typical executives in the room. How do you deal with all of their competing priorities when it comes to digital?
Well, I don't know. I think that's a very tricky question. I wouldn't say that we've learned how to do that quite yet. I often find that we step on landmines every now and then. But what I've learned so far is that it is helpful for us to build one-on-one alignment with each one of these stakeholders, and try to be, so we're an external party, but we try to be the glue as much as it is possible for an external party like us to be the glue. But it's very, very tricky, and you have to strike a very delicate balance of being able to understand what each of their priorities are, and then be able to create some sort of a roadmap that all of them agree with. But then one thing that I find helpful is if we're successful in getting the executive leadership in that room or in some way involved, that has a very big impact. And then one other thing that we've also now started to do, and I've learned again in the last year and a half, is that at some point when you're doing such a large initiative, us as the partner, we need to have some sort of direct alignment and access to the top level, C-level decision makers. Obviously, they're never going to be tactically involved. There's going to be some sort of quarterly review or whatever, what have you. But there absolutely has to be some direct access where we can lean on them from time to time to push and expedite specific projects or specific initiatives. And then the way we start is, we align with them in terms of business objectives. We try to understand what their business objectives are. We try to look at the entire engagement with that lens. And we spend a lot of time discovering and identifying what those are for the next 2, 3, 5 years. And then from there, we can then start to have more focused conversations with each of these stakeholders. And then that enables us to put together an entire roadmap, manage risks, manage priorities and dependencies, how each of those projects are going to come together and work together and move the needle. So these are 2 or 3, I think, very high level, things that I've figured out in order to try and move the projects forward, the engagement forward, and then try to be the glue as much as possible. It's very tricky, but we try.
Yeah, I also think it's go back to the beginning of our conversation where I think if you're talking about e-commerce, you get put into a bucket that nobody should get put in, because commerce, the transaction, really shouldn't be the focus of any of this, right? So if you can shift the conversation to digital transformation has broad implications across all of those leadership initiatives and those competing priorities, right? From finance to supply chain to operations to sales. digital transformation, has implications across all of those that can be addressed with digital initiatives. But if you keep talking about e-commerce, I think it's just, becomes it gets a little bit silly and you get tuned out. I think a lot of that comes down to language. And what do you kind of see as the main gaps between the business, the executive team, and the digital team when it comes to language?
So when it comes to language, what I find is that I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if language is a big disconnect, at least when it comes to when we're talking about within the organization. What I find is a little bit different in my interactions with these businesses is that sometimes our language and their language is not the same. That I find more of that rather than their language internally not being the same. What I often see happen is the disconnect I do see is that each of these functions is very focused on their outcomes, and that actually happens quite often is they have their own KPIs and they have their own metrics in terms of how they are defining success of their projects. But then the top leadership is thinking P&L. They're thinking, how much money do I spend? How much resources do I allocate internally? What is the opportunity cost of me doing this initiative? How much disruption does this entire digital transformation initiative cause internally? How much friction do I have to take care of? And then at the end of that whole 2-3 years, whatever, what is the ROI I'm looking at? Am I expanding into new markets? Am I expanding a new product line? What is the growth trajectory? So they are up there looking at very high level business outcomes and objectives, and that is usually how they're defining, the cost and the benefit, right? So again, cost is not just the dollar value; it's all these other things. While all these different functions are looking at it, sort of with a narrow focus. For example, finance is very, very focused on all the numbers, and they don't necessarily always see the value in the money being spent, and they don't necessarily see all of this as an investment. They see it as OPEX when it should really be CAPEX, and not always would your champions be able to make that case. And so they would push for there to be ROI in 3 months or 6 months when it's a long 2-year project. And so you would realize sometimes, of course, there's going to be ROI realization along the way, but the real benefits come together when you have this big piece of work that gets pushed out, and everything starts to fall into place. In the same way, when you look at marketing, they're looking at very key digital metrics. One thing that I often running into is paying money for media spend and ad spend and all of those things, and how the ROI is calculated on those activities. That many times, unfortunately, marketing leaders tend to paint a very rosy picture of we spent $1 and we made $2, while the 2 is revenue and not margin or contribution margin, or it doesn't factor in always the opportunity cost or the operational cost of fulfilling those things. So that's the disconnect I feel that happens. And then another thing that happens from there is as they mature, and this is perhaps an outcome of success, is when we're able to help these merchants mature digitally, and as they mature and they start to grow, and now they start to form teams, functional teams, dedicated teams that do these specific marketing functions or digital functions or IT functions. Then what starts to happen is you start to develop silo, and you start to develop these silo dictionaries and glossaries where they start to use different language at that point, and they start to develop different definitions, and that starts to create confusion and misalignment. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think, if I'm thinking about the listener to this, if you're a digital leader, I read an article recently of a young woman who accelerated really, really fast through her organization. And she was asked, like, what made you accelerate? It was a very difficult organization to accelerate through. And she was asked, like, what is there one thing, or what can you attribute your rise through this organization? And she said, yeah, absolutely. She said, I always spoke the language of my manager. I never spoke my language. And then she said, not only that, but even though there were other people that were trying to make themselves look smart by talking their language, when I always spoke the language of my manager, and while I might not have used terms that other people were using, I was always understood, and I was always aligned with the objectives of my manager. And I just love that, because I think it can be translated to anyone like, think of your CEO as your manager. What's the language that they talk about the business in? And then how do you translate what you're doing into their language? Even though you will feel smarter if you use digital terms, if you use your acronyms and use terms that nobody understands, you might feel smarter in that moment, but you won't be as understood. And being understood, I think being understood and being clear, and for people to get behind your initiatives, I think is more important than looking smart. And so I really think that's a big part of it.
I think you make a very important point. I think that's absolutely true.
I mean, that language. So when you're trying to explain it, even the number of things you choose to share with your executive team, right? Instead of sharing 10, share 3. Make sure everybody understands what those 3 things are, right? Versus showing 10 and everybody kind of getting lost. I just think it's such an important thing. What role do you see kind of culture playing inside of the organization?
I see that at 2 levels. Again, depending on how big and mature these organizations are, what I find is that smaller organizations that are less than 100 people tend to have a common culture. When you talk about distributors are usually sales heavy, and you're going to have a strong sales culture in distributors. With manufacturing organizations, you'll tend to see a strong focus on product. They're both different cultures, but if you have the right people and the right leaders, they're going to draw from the best. They're going to draw the best, let's say, elements of each of those mindsets. So when when you're working with an organization that's less than 100 people, I think culture is easier because they're all close enough. They haven't quite segregated into all these different functions, at least not yet, where they each develop a different culture in the team. So when we, for example, engage with those organizations, it is relatively easier to drive digital transformation initiatives. I say relatively, because then leadership is more accessible. Leadership is more accessible to their internal people as well as to us. And so the communication is so much smoother, it's simpler. There aren't barriers, there aren't so many layers. And even if the team doesn't necessarily do a good job of structuring communications, etc., it just happens naturally and organically, simply because there aren't enough teams, there aren't enough boundaries with those teams. But then for larger organizations where there are discrete functions and then there are leaders within those functions, that is when what happens is each of those functions start to develop their own culture, and that culture is driven by their function. Marketing, of course, sees things a certain way that enables them to do their job. But then, in terms of culture, one thing that happens very often in medium or larger organizations is they lose appreciation for the pain points and the issues of the other stakeholders in this entire process. IT is supposed to enable marketing, sales, product, but then IT starts to take a very narrow view of each problem, each technical problem, and then the same thing happens. So I think it's very important if, as the organization grows, it is extremely important that each of the leaders of these functions retains that core culture of the organization, whatever it was. And if they do that, that culture will then permeate into those teams. And so, of course, there needs to be an open culture in terms of empathy for each of the different functions. If those things are there, and again, if executive alignment is there to support all this, then these initiatives get relatively easier to implement and to drive that change. But when there is a very hard and narrow focus for each of these functions and these teams to only focus on their key deliverables without having a more holistic view, then that becomes difficult. And I think as part of all that, what also has a very big impact is personal relationships across these different functional leaders. If there are strong personal relationships across these people, I think that in and of itself creates a lot of fluid flow of information, not just within them, but even in their teams. Conversations become easier and open. Information flows better, and so I think there's something to be said for a whole lot of informal culture, rather than just your hierarchies and your information systems and how the information is structured and how it flows and the workflows. All that is extremely important, but then relationships within the organization, I think, have a very, very big impact. They sort of fly under the radar most times because they're not tangible. It's very hard to measure them and see them, but I've seen firsthand when key stakeholders have a good personal one-to-one relationship, that just makes everything more fluid.
Let's talk about Codup and what you've built. Where do you guys kind of serve a specific niche or a specific type of manufacturer distributor? Where are you guys kind of finding the most success today in 2025?
So yes, so when it comes to the types of companies we work with, we generally try to work with organizations that are either just on the cusp of growing or have perhaps grown very aggressively in the last 3-4 years for using whatever systems at their disposal. Many of our customers fall in this latter bucket where they've been able to use systems with in-house resources. There's usually a champion. There's usually someone who initiated this internally, aligned all the stakeholders. So this is usually someone who's experienced, but also young enough. Age. I've seen age play a major factor. Most of these people tend to be between 40 and 50, where they're experienced enough to see the issues and be able to identify there's something needs to change within the organization. They're experienced enough so they have enough clout and the relationships, in the organization. They have enough authority to be able to, bring all the key stakeholders together. But they're not so old that they're not seeing past whatever their worldview is, and they're seeing technology as an enabler. I see that age is such a big factor in this. And so, when we go in, we try to find this champion. And so many times this champion has already done the first iteration, and they've stitched together systems as best they could. They've put in some functions, and they've put in a team that's homegrown. They pull in people from different functions, and they sort of make a core team. And that core team, isn't necessarily they're not professionals at this, but they have the right motivations. They're very, they're high initiative, and they're big stakeholders in the organization, and they're all aligned. Usually these are 3 or 4 people. But then they understand that they don't know what they don't know, and so now they go seek external help. And so all that alignment has enabled them to 2x the business, let's say, in the last 3 years. And these are usually organizations that are 50, 60, sometimes 100 years old. But then you now have this group of 3 or 4 people who really drove this change internally, and they grew, say, 2x. And we see that very, very commonly. But then they get to a point where they realize that, they were able to sort of push through with brutal force, and they were able to create all this growth. But now they need systems. Now they need professionals coming in. Now they need to visualize, and they need a roadmap, and they need strategy, and they need a strategic player and a tactical player to pull all that together. And so that's where we usually come in. There's already been a journey to some degree, and so there's a lot of appreciation for what we then bring to the table. So, I usually find that these are manufacturers and distributors. Usually they're doing between 70, 80 million to 150 million most times. And then sometimes these are bigger organizations. In those cases, they've already done perhaps 2 phases of digital transformation, and so they already have maturity. They're far ahead in the digital maturity curve. They have these discrete functions, but then that's where some of that comes into play. What we were talking about, where you have these different functional leaders, but then they need some professional help to have a roadmap that sort of puts all that together and tries to bring all the stakeholders together as much as possible and have a common roadmap. To factor in all the different needs of each different function, and do it in a way that it balances the priorities, balances the business vision, and then balances whatever budgetary constraints there may be or time constraints there may be. So that's very high level of the kind of organizations we want to work with. We're starting to verticalize. I think we've started to find that. Because we've traditionally been a very engineering-heavy, dev-heavy organization, which I find, interestingly, I find that's not very common in space. And so because of that focus, we tend to gravitate naturally towards businesses that are very complex. One of the ways that it manifests is us being able to create systems and digital experiences that would simplify a very complex configurator build. So you have very complex machinery or hardware or these configurable systems that many of our customers initially say to us, we don't believe we can have a digital experience. Our product is just too complex. But then, over time, we're able to distill and synthesize all that complexity into easy web interfaces and mobile interfaces, and drive adoption that way internally as well as with customers. So we gravitate towards complexity for that reason, because we have the knowledge and the experience internally to put our engineering experience to work and really do a good job of simplifying that complexity.
Is that what you consider one of your big differentiators, being so engineering focused?
I do. When it comes to B2B, there is a lot of complexity, and there's not a lot of standard, let's say flows. You talk about direct consumer. The world has been doing direct to consumer now for 25 plus years, and so you have a basic flow. Everyone's going to have this basic backbone of homepage, collections, PDP, cart checkout. There's going to be 100 different variations of that, but you have the backbone. You have the skeleton, right? That's not quite the case with B2B, or at least not yet. So there's a lot of unique use cases every time. And so our engineering ability enables us to be able to take that head on and be able to solve those challenges, while many of our competitors are unable to in that context specifically.
Do you guys have focus on certain platforms that you work with?
We work with the mid-market, so we have a lot of focus on Shopify and BigCommerce. Shopify is up and coming in the B2B space, and not a lot of people know, or let's say many organizations are on the fence about whether it can handle complexity. And it is maturing. Of course, there are definitely other platforms out there that are more mature when you look at the B2B context. That's 100% the case. But we are putting a lot of bets on Shopify because we see them shipping out and building very aggressively, very rapidly. And then again, as that engineering-focused organization, we are very, very well suited to plug that gap. In fact, we have in the next month and a half, we have literally about 7 applications going live on the Shopify ecosystem, chipping away at some of the very complex B2B use cases that Shopify doesn't cater to today. But then again, at the same time, they're building very fast. So Shopify is definitely up and coming for us. But then we've been working with BigCommerce for a long time. We've been doing a whole lot on WooCommerce. WooCommerce was the first platform we started working with 13 years ago. It gets a very bad rep, and people enjoy beating it up on social media, but I say it all the time. It is a phenomenal platform if you know how to use it right.
And that's a lot of times companies will like start there with, coming from WordPress especially.
Yes, they do.
You see that most often in the WordPress world first, but you're saying it actually has chops in the
absolutely
B2B commerce world.
Oh, absolutely. We built, I don't know if you know, we built a full-blown platform on top of WooCommerce about 4 or 5 years ago. And we have very mature capabilities on top of WooCommerce, and we have done hundreds of implementations. And of course, there are other types of implementations that come into play, but
Sure.
WooCommerce, the platform itself, we've never found it limiting. Now, there are some legitimate concerns in terms of security, in terms of infrastructure, manageability. Those are very legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
But it's an open source platform, and there's solutions to. Oh, look, there's no platform that is without its flaws and strengths.
That's right.
So it's a tool at the end of the day. You put it in the right hands, and you'll make the best of that tool.
Have you guys built like accelerators on WooCommerce for B2B?
We have not built accelerators on WooCommerce. We are building a major accelerator on Shopify as we speak.
Okay.
And that is, in fact, that's going to go live in about 2 weeks on the platform, and we're doing some major activations with Shopify around that accelerator. That accelerator specifically focuses on lighting manufacturers, and so we're chipping away lighting.
Oh, amazing.
So lighting, residential, commercial, architectural, so they sell through the integrated channel, through the live events channel. They sell through architects and commercial projects. So we have a couple of some very good customers in that space, and so we've learned the space very well in the last 2 years, and so we're putting all that good experience to use, and we've put together a very good package that strikes at some of the very big pain points in that space.
Oh, I love that. I think there's so many times that electrical distributors will have, like, it's not necessarily a separate company, but certainly a certain separate business unit just for lighting. And that's a completely, like, their electrical distribution business is very electrical distribution, right? Very, like, male heavy, male dominated, every kind of thing you kind of see. And then you'll have the showroom, which is like normally just a beautiful, gorgeous showroom for that. So that's amazing that you're building that. I love that. Love that focus.
No, you mentioned a very important point, right? So you got your contractors and electricians. That's one channel, but then there's so many. It's very interesting when you get into these verticals. It looks like lighting, when you look at it from the outside, but then it has so many sub-verticals. You've got the integrated space, and you've got the electricians and the contractors. There's many different types of contractors. Then you've got, architectural and commercial and outdoor and live events. So, it's all lighting, but then you have all these different nuances depending on which space you're playing in.
I love that. So Asim, you focused this part on kind of execution and engineering as a differentiator, and yet a lot of our conversations have been very strategic. I know you guys do a lot of strategy work. How do you guys balance strategy, execution, and how should companies look at you? How should companies think about you in that process?
That's a very interesting question. When as Codup grew up, to be fair, as an engineering heavy organization, and we were doing engineering mostly around e-commerce use cases for the last many years, but I think we've sort of gone through a transformation in the last 2 years where we've brought on some very senior leadership, strategic leadership, And so what that has enabled us to do is align with our customers very strategically. And so today, when we go in, we try to align ourselves with the top C-level executives and understand at a very high level what their business objectives are, where they are today, where they need to go, what market do they operate in, who their customers are, who their different segments are, why those segments buy from them, how do they talk to those different segments. In the context of lighting, for example, there's different channels that you can sell lighting through, and what you'll see a lot of these lighting manufacturers do is they will create sub-brands to go through each of those channels. And so, really taking a very putting in a lot of time and effort to understand their business very deeply so that's a whole lot of front loading and doing a whole lot of discovery up front. And what that enables us to do really, and one very important point I want to make here is that when we're doing that, it's all business conversation. We're looking at customers, marketing, messaging, branding, all that. It's not technology at all. So that's the first high level. And then from there, we're able to then get into some other areas like, what do your marketing channels look like? What are your best marketing channels? Where does a brand need to go? Let's look at some of your operational metrics and systems. So again, before we would take on even a single project, we are putting in a lot of time and effort into understanding the business, the objectives, the mission, their customers, their market space, competition, and then internally operations, functions, hierarchies. And so we're doing all that because all that then informs how would we engage with them. What that uncovers a ton of challenges that they weren't thinking about. So when they're thinking, it's a lot of people say this, when you're close enough to the problem, you don't quite see it because it's right in front of you. You're in the problem every day. Then we come in with fresh eyes, we're able to hear all that, we're able to look at all these different things, and we're able to talk to different stakeholders in the organization and get to some different conclusions sometimes than the conclusions they were on. And then that informs all of our technology work which we do. All that converts into a roadmap, whether that's a roadmap stretching out over a year or stretching out over 5 years, depending on whatever they need. And so the roadmap tends to be a whole bunch of technology projects that work together rather than discrete, isolated, standalone projects that don't do anything together. So they're all dependent on each other. They all amplify each other. You may need a platform, you may need a platform migration, or you may not need it. You may need to evaluate 5 different platforms, and you may need to upgrade your CRM, and sometimes you may even need to change your ERP or upgrade an ERP. Or we've had scenarios where a brand or a merchant was ready to rip off their ERP, and we were able to go in and say, you don't need that at all. The problem lies somewhere else, right? But we can only do that if we take that top-down approach and start with the why and the what rather than get directly down to projects. And so that enables us to do a very good job because we're not looking at it as projects. We're looking at it from that lens of business objectives. And each project that we will do, they have to all work together. They have to fit together like a pieces of a puzzle. And then they all have to align to that large strategic vision that the C-level has. So that, I think, really differentiates us. And one thing that I often tell people is we are the strategists, but then from there we'll come 1-2 levels down and we'll be the tacticians and we'll execute with their teams and we'll align with all the different teams and make it all happen. And then of course we don't do everything in-house. We do what we're good at. And then we've, with the last 2 years, one of the things we've done well is we've put together an ecosystem of some really strong partners in marketing, branding, a whole lot of other training, a whole lot of these different services that we don't do in-house. We don't want to do in-house. That's not our strength. We're engineers to this day. We pride ourselves on being very good engineers. So we've built together this very strong ecosystem where we can bring in the best people for the right job.
Very good. Awesome. This was an amazing conversation. Appreciate you being here and for your insights. And we need to do it again real soon.
Absolutely, just a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that we did it.
Manufacturers, distributors, leaders in the zone. If you're building B2B, this the podcast throne. The industry's heartbeat, we're setting the tone. Turn insights to actions, it's how empires are grown. We're talking change management, breaking resistance. Strategies so sharp, they redefine persistence. Customer adoption, it's more than retention. It's building a movement, commanding attention. It's the B2B e-commerce show, where the vision is clear and the strategies glow. From the top of the globe, we're the pros who know. Turn the volume up loud, it's time to grow. We bring news, big topics, insights to spark. From the boardroom's glow to the warehouse dark. Digital transformations, the path we're paving, helping you lead through the change you're facing. This is more than a podcast, it's the industry's voice, giving you the tools to make the right choice. No fluff, just facts, no hype, just action. The show where solutions are more than a fraction. It's the B2B e-commerce show, where the vision is clear and the strategies glow. From the top of the globe, we're the pros who know. Turn the volume up loud, it's time to grow.
This is your guide to the digital race. Practical advice, no time to waste. So tune in, gear up, and let's own the space. It's the B2B e-commerce show, the industry's base.